F-16 fighter jets followed this plane and nobody knew why. Every single passenger stared outside in shock. But one woman never moved. She already knew. When the pilots finally realized who she was, the radio went silent. She was Eagle One, a woman the entire military believed was dead. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The morning started like every other morning at Gate 14 of Denver International Airport. People moved fast, pulling bags behind them, checking their phones, buying coffee from the small stands near the walls, and staring up at the big boards that showed departure times. Nobody paid attention to anyone else. That is the way airports work. Everyone is too busy thinking about where they are going to notice who is standing right next to them. The noise of the place filled every corner. Announcements over the speakers. Wheels rolling on hard floors. Children asking questions that their parents were too tired to answer. It was loud and busy and completely ordinary. She stood at the back of the boarding line with a small black bag over her shoulder. Her name on the ticket was Sarah Cole. She was 34 years old, with brown hair pulled back in a simple knot, a light blue shirt, dark jeans, and worn travel shoes. She wore no jewelry except a small silver band on her right wrist. She had no makeup on. She carried nothing in her hands. She looked like someone who had taken this kind of trip many times before and had stopped finding it interesting a long time ago. Her face was calm. Not the kind of calm that comes from a good night of sleep or from having nothing to worry about. The kind of calm that comes from years of training yourself to show nothing on the outside, no matter what is happening on the inside. It was a very specific kind of stillness, the kind that most people never learn and a very small number of people are taught by people who spend their lives in dangerous places. She found her seat without asking the flight attendant for help. Row 22, seat C, on the aisle. She had not selected a window seat. She had not wanted a window seat on any flight in the past 6 years. Windows showed the sky, and the sky still did something to her that she did not like. Looking at it from the inside of a commercial aircraft, with a cup of bad coffee in her hand and other people pressing in on every side of her, brought back images and feelings she had worked very hard to keep buried. So she always chose the aisle, where she could see the interior of the plane and not the world outside it. Flight 408 from Denver to Washington, D.C. was a standard commercial service. 212 passengers in total. A crew of 8. A Boeing 737 that had made this exact same trip more times than anyone on board had counted. There was nothing unusual about it. The pilot, Captain Daniel Ross, had been flying commercial aircraft for 19 years. He had done this specific route more times than he could easily remember. He was the kind of man who liked routine. He liked knowing exactly what would happen and when it would happen. He was good at his job precisely because he had never needed to handle anything that fell outside the ordinary. Sarah put her bag in the overhead bin and sat down. The man in the window seat next to her was already asleep before the doors even closed, his head tilted against the curved plastic of the fuselage wall, a small neck pillow around his collar. The woman across the aisle was watching something on a tablet with earphones in. A child 2 rows back was crying in a soft, tired way while his mother made shushing sounds that were not helping much. Everything was normal. Everything was exactly the way it was supposed to be. The plane pushed back from the gate at 7:43 in the morning, right on schedule. Takeoff was smooth. The clouds over Denver were thin and white, stretched out in long flat layers, and the plane climbed through them easily without any of the shaking that makes nervous flyers grip their armrests. Sarah looked at her hands. She did not look out the window. She ordered water from the flight attendant when the cart came by and drank it in small sips. She had a book in her bag that she had been meaning to start for 2 months, but she did not take it out. She just sat there, looking at nothing in particular, breathing slowly in the rhythm she had taught herself years ago. 4 seconds in. Hold. 4 seconds out. It was something her flight instructor had made her practice every morning during the first weeks of her training. Back when she had been learning to become something other than what she was born as. She had been living in Denver for almost 5 years. Before that, she had spent a year in a small town in northern Montana, where the winters were so cold and dark that she had almost convinced herself she could disappear into them completely. Before Montana, she had been in New Mexico for 8 months. Before that, a small city in Oregon. She moved often. She had learned that staying in one place for too long was not good for her, not because she got bored or restless, but for practical reasons that she did not explain to anyone. She had a job that she did entirely from a laptop, consulting work that was vague enough that people stopped asking questions about it after the first time she explained it. She had no close friends in any of the cities she had lived in. She had no social media presence of any kind. She paid for most things with cash when she could. She had built a life that was quiet and small and very hard to see if you were not looking directly at it, and that was exactly the way she intended it to remain. For years before she had started building that kind of life, she had been someone very different. She had been part of a military program that very few people knew the name of and even fewer knew the details of. She had been trained in things that she was not going to think about on this flight. She was not going to think about any of that. She was going to sit in row 22, seat C, drink her water, and land in Washington, D.C. in 2 hours and 40 minutes and take a cab to the hotel where she was scheduled to have 2 meetings about a project that had nothing to do with the sky or the military or any of the things she used to be. It was at the 1-hour mark that things changed. The plane was cruising at 37,000 feet, somewhere above Nebraska, flat brown land very far below, when the lead flight attendant, Maria, noticed something on the small display screen mounted near the galley at the front of the cabin. She was not entirely sure what she was seeing, but it looked wrong in a way she could not immediately name. She had been working commercial flights for 11 years. She trusted the feeling that something looked wrong. She walked quickly to the cockpit door and knocked twice, the way the protocol said, and Captain Ross opened it within a few seconds. She told him what she had seen. He looked past her into the cabin for a moment, and then he turned back to his instruments. He had already seen something on his own display that he had been trying to decide how to respond to. 2 aircraft had appeared on the radar, keeping pace with Flight 408, roughly 400 meters to the right side of the aircraft. They had appeared 5 minutes ago. He had hoped they were some kind of technical artifact, a ghost reading, the kind of thing that sometimes happened at this altitude. But they were not moving the way ghost readings moved. They were moving the way real aircraft moved, with purpose and precision. He looked out his side window. And there they were. 2 F-16 fighter jets, flying in tight military formation alongside the commercial plane, close enough that the pilots inside them were clearly visible through the canopy glass. Their gray metal bodies were sharp against the blue sky, catching the morning light along every edge. They were flying with the kind of focus that military pilots fly with when they have been sent somewhere with a specific purpose. Captain Ross had been flying commercial aircraft for 19 years and he had never once had 2 F-16 fighter jets appear beside his plane. He had absolutely no preparation for what he was feeling right now, which was a very cold, very clear variety of fear. He contacted air traffic control immediately. He gave his position and described what he was seeing. The response from air traffic control was not the kind of response that made him feel better. He was told that the F-16 fighter jets were operating under a classified military directive. He was told that they were authorized to fly in proximity to Flight 408 for reasons that he did not have clearance to know. He was told to maintain his current heading and altitude and to remain calm. He was told not to make any announcement to the passengers yet. He was told to wait for further instructions. He sat in his seat and stared out at the 2 F-16 fighter jets that were following this plane through the sky, and he told himself to remain calm. It was the hardest thing he had been asked to do in 19 years of commercial aviation. In the cabin, a few passengers near the right side windows had already noticed. A teenage boy in the 5th row pressed his face against the glass and announced loudly that there were fighter jets out there. Within 30 seconds, Everyone on the right side of the plane was leaning toward the windows and a large number of people on the left side were trying to see past the people on the right. Phones came out. Videos began recording. People posted things to social media. People sent text messages. People called out to each other across the aisle with questions that no one could answer. The child who had been crying stopped crying because his mother was now too busy pressing her face against the window to pay attention to him. Sarah heard the commotion. She heard the boy's voice, and the whispers spreading through the rows, and the shuffling sounds of 200 passengers suddenly all moving in the same direction at once. She did not look up. She kept her eyes on the tray table in front of her. But something had changed in her body the moment the boy had spoken. A tension had come into her shoulders and the back of her neck, a very specific kind of tension that she recognized. Not fear, exactly. Something more like the feeling of a circuit completing. The feeling of something she had kept carefully turned off suddenly turning itself back on. She had felt the F-16 fighter jets before she heard about them. She had felt the change in the air pressure that large military aircraft create when they fly very close to a commercial plane. It was a subtle thing, barely a vibration, the kind of thing that only someone who had spent thousands of hours in the sky would recognize. But she had spent thousands of hours in the sky. Her body remembered what her mind had been trying to forget. She kept her breathing controlled. She kept her face still. She did not move. She sat in row 22 and counted her breaths and tried to think very clearly about what she was going to do next. Inside the cockpit of the lead F-16 fighter jet, Major James Holt was doing his job. He was 38 years old, with the sharp, precise eyes that good fighter pilots develop after years of scanning skies for things that move wrong. He had been scrambled from base 2 hours ago with very limited information. The alert that had come through to his commanding officer had used channels that Holt had only seen used twice before in his career, both times in situations he was not allowed to discuss. The message itself had been brief. Possible classified personnel on board civilian aircraft. Flight 408, Denver to Washington. Monitor and observe. Do not engage. Await further instruction. His wingman in the second F-16 fighter jet was Captain Dana Pierce. She was 31, 4 years his junior in rank, and in Holt's opinion one of the most naturally gifted pilots he had ever flown alongside. She was quieter than him by temperament and more systematic in how she worked through problems. The moment they had gotten airborne, she had begun pulling up everything available on Flight 408. Passenger manifest. Flight plan. Aircraft history. Crew records. Most of it was routine. Most of it was exactly what you would expect on a standard commercial route on a Tuesday morning in the middle of winter. But one entry on the manifest had flagged. Not loudly. Not with the kind of obvious red warning that would have been easy to respond to. Just a soft, quiet flag that linked to a file identifier and then immediately returned a restricted access message. The file itself was sealed at a classification level that neither of them had authorization to open. Holt had reported it up the chain while they were still climbing to altitude. He had been told that someone with proper clearance was reviewing it. He had been told to fly close and observe the aircraft and report anything unusual. Holt brought the F-16 fighter jet closer to the commercial plane, close enough to use his helmet's optical system to see inside the passenger windows. He scanned the visible rows carefully. An older man asleep with his mouth slightly open. A woman arguing in sign language with the person next to her. A group of young people in matching university sweatshirts taking photographs of each other with the window behind them showing the wing of the plane. A man reading a newspaper, which Holt found somewhat remarkable because he had not seen anyone read a newspaper on a plane in years. And then, in row 22, on the aisle, a woman sitting perfectly still. He almost moved past her. She was not doing anything. She was not looking out the window. She was not taking photographs. She was not doing what every other passenger in that cabin was doing, which was reacting. The F-16 fighter jets had appeared beside this plane and every single other person on board was doing something in response to that. They were excited or scared or confused or some combination of all three. They were moving, speaking, pointing, filming. This woman was doing none of those things. She was sitting in her seat with her hands flat on the tray table and her eyes directed at a point slightly above and in front of her, and she was completely, absolutely still. Holt said, "Pierce. Row 22. Aisle seat. Look." Pierce shifted her position slightly to get a better angle. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I see her." They watched for another full minute. The commercial plane passed through a minor pocket of turbulence, not severe, just enough to give a little shake to the aircraft and make the overhead bins rattle slightly. Everyone around the woman in row 22 responded. A man gripped his armrests. A woman pulled her coffee cup away from the edge of the tray table. A child made a startled noise. The woman in row 22 did not respond in any visible way. Her body absorbed the movement the way a trained pilot's body absorbs turbulence, automatically and completely without tension, because she had spent years learning to treat the movement of an aircraft as something completely normal. Pierce said, "That is not how a civilian passenger sits during turbulence." Holt was already reaching for his radio. In the military command center at Offutt Air Force Base, Colonel Warren Briggs was listening to the reports coming in from the two F-16 fighter jets that had been sent to follow the plane. He was 56 years old. He had gray hair kept very short and a face that had seen too many things to show surprise easily. He had been in military intelligence and operations for 31 years. He had worked in programs that did not appear on any public list and reported to committees that did not appear on any public record. He had started this morning expecting a quiet day of meetings and reports. That was no longer the case and had not been since the flagged manifest entry had come to his attention 40 minutes ago. He typed a request into his secured system and waited while it processed. The first layer of the file that came back was what he already knew. A name. A photograph. A service record that ended abruptly 6 years ago with a stamp he had seen too many times. Deceased. Archived. Case closed. He typed a second request. A deeper query that required 2 separate physical key cards and a voice confirmation code that changed every 12 hours. He waited longer this time. When the results came back, they did not agree with the first set. They described someone who was not deceased and not archived and whose case, by any reasonable reading of the evidence, had never actually been properly closed at all. They described the location where that person had been last confirmed alive. They described the false documentation that had been created to support the official account. And they described, in more detail than Briggs was comfortable reading in a room where other people could see his screen, the nature of the operation that had made all of it necessary. He sat back in his chair. He thought for a long moment. Then he pressed the button to connect directly to Holt's channel. He said, "Major Holt. The individual you flagged in row 22 is a former operative from a classified program called Raptor Division. She was a field specialist, the only field operative in the program's history to be cleared for live deployment in active combat airspace. Her designation, when she was active and before the program was dissolved, was Eagle 1. The radio was silent. Then Holt said, "Colonel, Eagle 1 was declared killed in action 6 years ago. We were all briefed on the dissolution of that program. The whole unit was closed down." Briggs said, "That is what the official record states." "Yes." Pierce's voice came through. She said, "Are you telling us the official record is incorrect?" Briggs looked at the photograph on his screen. The woman in the photograph was younger, in uniform, her hair shorter, her expression more open. But the face was the same face that Holt had described in row 22. The jaw. The eyes. The particular quality of stillness in the way she held herself even in a still photograph. "Yes," he said. "That is exactly what I am telling you." In the cabin, Sarah felt the F-16 fighter jets change their formation again. They were now flying even closer, and they had adjusted their angle slightly, not dramatically, just enough that if you knew what you were looking at you could tell it was deliberate. A repositioning. A tightening. The kind of movement that in a military context would signal that a decision had been made and was now being acted upon. She pressed her back against her seat. She thought about what options she had. They were not many. She was on a commercial aircraft at 37,000 feet. There were 211 other people on this plane who had nothing to do with whatever was about to happen. She could not do anything that would put them at risk. That was not negotiable. It had never been negotiable, not even in the worst moments of her years as an operative. The protection of uninvolved people was the line she had never crossed and would not cross now. She thought about the exits. She thought about the physics of the situation. She thought about what the two F-16 fighter jets would do next. She thought about who had sent them and what they wanted. She thought about whether this was the kind of situation she could manage or the kind she could not, and she arrived at the conclusion that it depended entirely on one factor she did not yet know, which was whether the people who had sent these jets were the same people who had destroyed her life 6 years ago or different people with different intentions. She had spent 6 years thinking about what had happened in the Pacific. She had spent 6 years running through every detail of that mission in her mind, looking for the piece she had missed, the thing she should have seen coming and had not. She had been good enough at her job to survive when she should not have survived. She had not been good enough to see that the real threat that night was not the enemy aircraft she had been tracking. The real threat had been the people on her own side. She had been used. She understood that. What she had never been able to fully understand was why. And the why still mattered to her, even now, even after 6 years of telling herself it did not. The flight attendant named Maria came to her row again. She crouched down beside Sarah's seat and spoke very quietly. She said that the captain had asked to speak with her privately. She said that it was not an emergency. Her hands were shaking slightly as she said it, which Sarah noticed immediately and which told her that whatever was about to happen had already been communicated to the flight crew and that the flight crew found it significant enough to be frightened by it. Sarah stood. She took nothing from her bag. She straightened her shirt and followed Maria toward the front of the cabin. She was aware of being watched as she walked. She did not look at the people watching her. She kept her posture relaxed and her pace even and her face completely neutral. She walked the way she had always walked into rooms where something difficult was about to happen. The cockpit door was opened by Captain Ross from the inside. He looked at her with the expression of a man who was doing everything he could to hold a professional face over a great deal of personal alarm. He pointed to the headset hanging on the wall. Sarah put it on. The voice that came through the headset stopped her for just a moment. Not visibly. Not in any way that Captain Ross, who was watching her very carefully, would have been able to see. But inside, something shifted. She knew that voice. It was older than she remembered. It had more weight in it. But she knew it. Colonel Warren Briggs said, Eagle One. She said, I left that name behind. It is not mine anymore. He said, I know. I understand why you feel that. And I am not going to argue with you about it right now because there is something more urgent that I need to tell you. She waited. He told her. He explained the situation in precise, clear terms, the way he had always communicated when things were serious. An unidentified aircraft had entered restricted airspace 38 minutes ago. It did not match any known military or commercial profile in their systems. It was not responding to any hailing frequency. It was moving in patterns that their best tracking software could not predict. Every intercept attempt had failed. Every time they committed to an approach vector, the aircraft changed its position in a way that made the approach useless. Their analysts had been working it for over half an hour and they had found nothing that gave them a way forward. Sarah stood in the small space near the cockpit door and listened to all of this without speaking. When Briggs finished, she said, How does it respond when your radar pings it? He said, It changes vector within 4 to 7 seconds. She said, always 4 to 7. Never outside that range? He checked with someone in the room with him. The answer came back, always within that window. She said, it is learning from your detection signals. Every time your radar finds it, it is recording the response time, the ping frequency, the direction of origin. It is using that data to model your entire tracking system in real time. That is why you cannot catch it. You are not chasing an aircraft. You are chasing something that is getting smarter every time you try to find it, because every attempt you make teaches it something new about how you operate. The radio was silent for 4 seconds. Then Holt's voice came through from the F-16 fighter jet still flying alongside. He said, that explains why every approach we have tried has failed. It was not random. It was reactive. Briggs said, can it be stopped? Sarah thought. She said, yes. But not by chasing it. You have to stop first. All active radar, all tracking signals, everything that is giving it input. You go completely dark. Every system you have goes silent for a specific period of time. Long enough for it to lose its model of how you operate, but not so long that you lose the thread of where it is entirely. Pierce said from her F-16 fighter jet, if we go dark, we lose eyes on it completely during that window. Sarah said, yes. You do. That is the only way this works. Right now your eyes are the problem. Every time your systems reach out to find it, you are telling it exactly where you are and exactly how fast you can react. You have to stop doing that. Briggs said, how long do we go dark? She said, 85 seconds. Not 90, not 70. 85. Any longer and it will have settled into a new holding pattern that you will not have data to predict. Any shorter and it will not have fully dropped its defensive orientation. Briggs said, and during those 85 seconds? She said, I will tell you where it is going to be when you come back online. Captain Ross made a very small sound from his seat. He was staring at the instrument panel in front of him and he was very clearly trying to process the conversation that was happening 4 feet away from him. Sarah looked at him briefly. She understood what he was experiencing. She said nothing to him. There was nothing she could say that would make this easier to understand. Briggs said, Eagle 1. I need to know you are certain. She said, I am not certain. I am never certain. I work with the best available information and I follow where the data leads. That is all anyone can do. What I can tell you is that I have been doing this for a long time and the math on this aircraft's movement pattern is as clear as any I have seen. There was a pause. Then Briggs said, tell me where it is going to be. Give me the bearing and altitude. She asked for the last 3 confirmed position points before the blackout would begin. He read them to her. She repeated them back inside her mind and built the picture the way she had always built pictures, starting with the data that was hardest to fake, the timing intervals, and working outward from there. She looked for the curvature in the pattern. Not the sharp angles that the tracking software had been watching for, because this aircraft was not making sharp angles. It was making slow, gradual arcs, the kind that a system optimizing for unpredictability would choose because they looked random even when they were not. She said, when you come back online, look at bearing 270, altitude 41,000 feet. That is where it will be. Holt said, you are that confident? She said, that is where the math says it will be. Briggs said, beginning blackout in 30 seconds. He counted down from 30 in a steady voice. At 0, every active detection system covering that corridor went silent. The radar stations. The tracking software. The communication systems that had been pinging the unidentified aircraft with every available frequency. All of it went dark at once. In the 2 F-16 fighter jets that were still flying alongside this plane, the screens that showed tracking data went blank. In the military monitoring room where Briggs was working, the displays that had shown the moving shape of the unidentified aircraft simply stopped. In the narrow space near the cockpit door of Flight 408, Sarah stood still and counted. The passengers in the cabin felt something change, though they had no way to name what it was. The F-16 fighter jets were still visible out the right side windows. The plane was still flying. Nothing about the physical experience of the flight had changed. But something had shifted in the feeling of the situation, the way a room feels different when someone turns off a device you did not realize was running. A low hum that you had stopped noticing becomes noticeable only when it goes away. Sarah counted. She kept her breathing steady. She did not let her mind produce doubts, because doubts were not useful in this moment. She stayed in the numbers. She stayed in the pattern. She tracked the invisible movement of an aircraft she could not see with a part of her mind that she had spent years training and years more trying to shut off, and she did not let go of the thread. At 81 seconds she said, "Come back online. Now. Do not wait for 85. Briggs said, "You said 85. She said, "The pattern shifted. It is adapting faster than I estimated. If you wait the full time, it will be outside the predicted window. Come online now." She heard someone in the room with Briggs say something quickly. Then Briggs said, "All systems online." 4 seconds of silence. Then Briggs said, in a voice that was very controlled but not quite controlled enough to hide what was underneath it, "Contact. Bearing 268. Altitude 41,400 feet. It is exactly where you said it would be." Holt's voice came through and she heard it in his voice too, that sound she had heard from other pilots before, the sound of a very good professional trying to sound like they encounter this kind of thing every day. He said, "We have it. Lock is solid and confirmed." Pierce came on the channel a second later. Her voice was quiet and she spoke slowly, like someone saying something out loud that they had been thinking for a while and were only now ready to admit. She said, "Holt. No system did that. No software. No trained analyst sitting at a desk. She found that aircraft in her head. From inside a commercial plane. While sitting in an aisle seat." Pierce paused. Then she said, "I need you to tell me who she actually is." Holt did not answer right away. He was quiet for 3 full seconds, which for a military pilot on an active channel is a long time to be quiet. Then he said, "I think we both already know. We have been watching her since Nebraska. The way she sat still when everyone else moved. The way she tracked our position without looking out the window. The way she read that aircraft's pattern from nothing but numbers. Pierce, there is only one program that ever produced someone who could do all of that. And there was only ever one person in that program who was cleared for live deployment." Pierce said, "That program was shut down. The operative was declared dead." Holt said, "Yes. That is what we were told." He looked out his canopy at the commercial plane still flying steady below and to his left, carrying 212 people who had no idea what was happening. He said, "I do not think she is dead, Pierce. I think we have been following this plane for the last hour because she is on it. And I think Command is about to confirm what we have already figured out." 2 seconds later, Briggs came on the line. He said, "Major Holt. Captain Pierce." The woman directing this intercept was the field operative of a classified program called Raptor Division. Her designation was Eagle 1. Both pilots went silent. "That is correct," Briggs continued. "She was declared killed in action 6 years ago. That declaration was false. She is alive, she is on Flight 408, and what you just watched her do is exactly what she was trained to do." He paused. "Now you know why we sent 2 F-16 fighter jets to follow this plane." Holt exhaled slowly. He said, "Understood, Colonel." Then, after a moment, he said something that he did not normally say on a military channel. He said, "I am glad she is alive." Briggs said, "Major Holt, you have authorization to move to intercept. You know what needs to be done. The two F-16 fighter jets that had been following this plane for over an hour peeled away from Flight 408 with a sharpness and speed that made several passengers gasp. They were gone in seconds, two gray shapes cutting across the sky in a direction that had nothing to do with the commercial aircraft anymore. Sarah watched them go through the small cockpit window. She watched them until they were too small to distinguish, and then she watched the empty sky where they had been. She stayed on the headset. She listened as Holt narrated the intercept approach. She gave him two small corrections to his angle, adjustments so small that Pierce asked her twice if she was sure. She was sure. She had made calculations like these in conditions far more difficult than this, in aircraft with failing instruments, in weather that made visibility nearly zero, in situations where other people had told her that what she was attempting was not possible. She had learned a long time ago that what other people decided was possible was not always an accurate guide to what actually was. The intercept took 9 minutes. The unidentified aircraft, deprived of the constant stream of detection signals it had been learning from, flew in a pattern that was almost exactly what Sarah had predicted it would fly. The two F-16 fighter jets came at it from an angle it had no data to predict and no time to adjust to. It was disabled over international airspace and went down in a controlled descent that the recovery teams on the ground were already positioned to respond to. When it was over, the sky outside Flight 408 was clear and empty and entirely normal. Briggs came back on the headset. He said, "Eagle 1. We have it. It is over." She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Good." He said, "What you just did. There is no system we have that would have found that aircraft the way you found it. You know that." She said, "I know." He said, "I need to tell you something. About 6 years ago. About what happened in the Pacific." She said, "I have been waiting 6 years for someone to tell me." He said, "I know. And I am sorry it took this long. What was done to your unit, to your program, to you specifically, was done by people inside our own organization who were pursuing interests that had nothing to do with any legitimate security objective. I did not know while it was happening. When I found out, I began building a case. That process has taken 6 years because of how deeply the people responsible embedded themselves in the system. But the case is complete. 3 individuals have been removed from their positions and are facing formal proceedings. The 4th, the one who gave the direct order that night, is under house arrest pending a full inquiry. Sarah stood in the narrow space near the cockpit door of a commercial aircraft flying over the middle of the American continent, and she listened to this. She had imagined hearing it many times. She had constructed versions of this conversation in her mind while lying awake in hotel rooms in Montana and New Mexico and Denver. She had thought about what she would feel when someone finally said these words to her. She felt a great deal. She was not going to describe any of it to the man on the other end of the headset. She said, "I want the complete file on the Pacific operation. Everything. Nothing removed or summarized." He said, "You will have it. I will send it to a secure channel tonight." She said, "And the people responsible. I want to see the evidence." He said, "That will take a little longer. But yes. You will see it." She said, "Then we are done for now." He said, "Eagle 1. She said, "My name is Sarah Cole." He said, "Yes. It is. And Sarah Cole just saved 212 people on a commercial aircraft and helped us identify and disable a threat that our best systems could not locate. I want you to know that that will be recorded. With your actual name. In a real file that will not be sealed or archived." She did not respond to this. She handed the headset back to Captain Ross. He took it in both hands and held it. He looked at her for a long moment. He was the kind of man who liked to know what was happening and to have words for it, and right now he did not have words for what had happened in his cockpit in the last hour and 15 minutes. He was a very experienced commercial pilot, and he had never once experienced anything like this. She nodded to him once. He nodded back. She turned and walked back through the cockpit door into the cabin. The walk back down the aisle felt different from the walk up. People were looking at her. The teenage boy tried to ask her something. She looked at him briefly and kept walking. She sat down in row 22, seat C. The man who had been sleeping for most of the flight was awake now and looking at her with an expression that suggested he had pieced together that she had something to do with whatever had been going on outside the windows. She looked at the seat back in front of her. She sat with her hands flat on her thighs. She breathed. 4 seconds in. Hold. 4 seconds out. 20 minutes later, Captain Ross came over the intercom. His voice was steady and professional and gave nothing away. He said that the situation in their area of airspace had been fully resolved. He said that Flight 408 was resuming its original route to Washington, D.C. He thanked the passengers for their patience and said that they would be landing approximately 40 minutes behind schedule. He said nothing else. Some passengers applauded. The teenage boy let out a long whoop that made the people around him laugh. The child in the back row had fallen asleep at some point during the last hour and did not wake up for the landing. His mother looked out the window at the clear, empty sky and seemed to be deciding something quietly. Sarah sat still through all of it. She did not applaud or speak or respond to the sounds around her. She looked at her hands. She thought about the file Briggs had promised to send. She thought about the 3 words she had carried for 6 years, the Pacific, that night, what happened, and the fact that she was going to have answers to them by the end of today. She thought about the name she had just heard herself called again. Eagle 1. She had not used it. She had not accepted it. She had corrected Briggs twice. And yet hearing it had done something to her that she could not entirely account for. It had not felt like hearing a stranger's name. And for the first time, she realized that 6 years of silence had not erased who she was. It had felt, despite everything she had decided about herself and her life since that night 6 years ago, like hearing her own. The plane landed at 12:22 in the afternoon. The descent had been clean and smooth and the touchdown was one of the better ones she had experienced, which she noticed without meaning to, the way a person who has spent thousands of hours in the air always notices the quality of a landing regardless of what else is going on in their mind. The passengers stood up the way passengers always do, immediately and all at once, before anyone had opened the doors. They pulled bags from overhead bins. They made phone calls. They sent messages. The teenage boy was already showing the video he had taken of the F-16 fighter jets to the boy next to him and narrating it with enthusiasm. Normal things. People doing the things people do when a flight ends. All of it feeling both very ordinary and, to Sarah, slightly unreal. She waited until the aisle cleared significantly before she stood. She was in no hurry. She took her bag from the overhead bin and carried it in her hand. She walked off the plane at the back of the group, through the jetway, into the terminal with its noise and light and the particular smell of airports that is the same everywhere in the world. She walked until she found a quiet section near a wall of windows that looked out over the tarmac. She stood there. Outside, aircraft moved in the slow and deliberate way they always moved on the ground, big heavy things carrying themselves with a caution that was completely at odds with what they became when they were in the air. She watched them without thinking about anything in particular. Her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. It said, "The complete Pacific file will be delivered to the secure channel at 8 p.m. tonight. All materials. Nothing removed." The message was signed with a single initial. She stared at the message for a while. Then she put the phone in her pocket. She looked back out at the tarmac. A plane was being pushed back from a gate far across the field. She watched it make the slow, patient turn that would point it toward the runway. She watched it until it went out of her line of sight. She thought about what she was going to do next. Not tonight, not this week, but in the larger sense. She had been living a life that was designed to be invisible and temporary and she had told herself that was fine, that it was practical, that it was enough. She had believed it for 5 years. She was not sure she believed it now. She was not the person she had been before the Pacific. She had never expected to go back to being that person, and she did not want to. But she was also not the person she had spent the last 6 years trying to become, because that person was built on a story that had not been entirely true and on a decision to disappear that had not entirely been her own. She did not know, standing at the window of Washington Dulles Airport in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, exactly who she was. She knew what she had just done. She knew what it had felt like to do it, the quietness that came over her when the data lined up, the particular clarity of making a decision in the middle of something serious and knowing, without any doubt at all, that the decision was right. She knew that she had felt more like herself in the last 2 hours than she had in the last 6 years combined. She stood at the window a while longer. Then she picked up her bag. She walked toward the exit. She pushed through the doors into the Washington afternoon, gray sky, cold wind, the city spread out around her in every direction, and she looked up at the sky the way she had not looked at it in 6 years. It was not frightening. It was just the sky. Wide and cold and honest and full of things moving through it that she could not see from the ground. She breathed in. 4 seconds. Hold. 4 seconds out. She did not know what she was going to do next. But the woman who had once been called Eagle One had stopped running from the sky today, and that was something. That was, she thought, perhaps the beginning of something that she was not yet ready to name but was ready, for the first time in a very long time, to let herself find. She walked into the city and she did not look back at the airport behind her. She had never been good at looking back. What she was good at was looking forward, at what was coming, at the shape of the thing before it arrived. She had always been able to see what was coming before anyone else did. Whatever was coming next, she would see it. And she would be ready for it. Not as a weapon. Not as an operative. Not as a ghost in someone else's file. As Sarah Cole. The name that was hers. The life that was going to be hers now, fully and on her own terms, with the whole truth of the past 6 years laid out in front of her by the end of tonight. The sky above the city was quiet and very wide and full of light that was just beginning to go gold at the edges as the afternoon moved toward evening. She walked under it without flinching. She had been 13 years old when she first sat in a cockpit. Not a real cockpit. A simulator at a small airfield 40 miles outside of Columbus, Ohio, where her uncle worked as a ground crew mechanic. He had taken her there on a Saturday morning in October when the sky was very clear and cold and the air smelled like machine oil and cut grass. He had lifted her into the left seat of a simulator that was supposed to teach private pilots the basics of instrument flight. She had pulled on the big headset that was too large for her ears and she had looked at all the dials and screens and she had felt, for the first time in her 13 years on Earth, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She had not become a military pilot right away. She had studied mathematics and physics in college because those were the subjects that came most naturally to her, the ones where the answers were clean and the patterns were visible once you knew how to look for them. She had joined the Air Force at 22 because it was the place where mathematics and flying existed together in the most serious possible way. She had been good from the beginning, not spectacular, not the kind of pilot whose instructors tell stories about them, but consistently and reliably good, the kind of pilot you wanted beside you when something went wrong because they would be calm and accurate and they would not panic. It was in her 3rd year of service that someone had noticed the other thing. The thing that was harder to train than flying and harder to evaluate than marksmanship or navigation. The thing that her commanding officer had described to her in a long private meeting as pattern recognition at an unusual level. He had shown her data sets, sequences of movements and decisions made by simulated enemy aircraft in a training exercise, and he had asked her to predict what the simulated aircraft would do next. She had done it correctly 17 times in a row before the evaluating officer had stopped the exercise and looked at her and then looked at the officer running the test and asked how long she had been practicing with this specific set. She had never seen that data set before. She had told them so. They had believed her. And that was how she had ended up in a program called Raptor Division, which did not appear on any public list, reporting to a small team of senior officers, doing work that required her to be in the sky and in the data at the same time, reading the movements of things that other people could not read and telling the people around her what was going to happen before it happened. She had been very good at it. She had been, in the judgment of the people who worked with her, the best that the program had ever produced. She had been called Eagle One from the beginning, not because she was a pilot exactly, though she was qualified to fly multiple aircraft types, but because of the combination of things she could do together, the flying, the pattern reading, the calm under pressure, the ability to be in the middle of a serious situation and still see it clearly from the outside, as if she were watching it from a distance while simultaneously being at the center of it. That combination had saved lives. She knew that to be true, even now, even after everything that had happened. The missions she had worked on, the threats she had helped identify and stop, the situations that had resolved the way they did partly because she had been in the right position at the right moment with the right information. That had been real. She had held on to that through all the years since the Pacific, not as comfort exactly, but as fact. What she had done had been real. What had been done to her had also been real. Both things were true at the same time. She walked past a coffee stand and stopped and ordered a coffee without really thinking about it. The woman behind the counter handed it to her and she paid and stood to one side and drank it in small sips while the people of Washington moved around her in every direction. She was very aware of her surroundings in the way she was always aware of her surroundings, the exits, the open space, the direction of the nearest crowd, the sight lines from the windows above. She had never been able to stop doing that, even in the quietest periods of the last 6 years, even in Montana when the nearest other person was sometimes miles away. She thought about Briggs. She thought about whether she believed what he had told her. She had been lied to by people she trusted before and she had learned to be careful with trust, not to refuse it entirely, because that was its own kind of prison, but to extend it slowly and verify it constantly. Briggs had been someone she trusted before the Pacific. He had given her no specific reason to stop trusting him. The fact that the world had fallen apart around her 6 years ago was not necessarily evidence that he had been part of it. She had known, in the clearest and most honest part of her thinking, that it was not Briggs who had given the order that night. She had known that from the beginning. She had just not known who had. If what he was telling her was true, if the people responsible were genuinely being held to account, then 6 years of her life had been taken from her and she was now getting back only what remained. That was not a small thing to process while standing on a sidewalk outside an airport with a paper cup of coffee in her hand. She was not going to be able to process it today. She was going to have to let it arrive slowly, the way difficult things always arrive, in pieces, over time, when the mind was ready for each piece and not before. She finished the coffee. She dropped the cup in a bin near the curb. She looked up at the sky one more time, this Washington sky in the middle of winter, the light fading at the edges as the afternoon grew later, the clouds moving in from the west. 2 aircraft were visible in the distance, not military, commercial, coming in toward the airport on their descent path. She watched them for a moment. She noted their angle and their speed. Old habits. She let herself have them. She did not push them away. She turned and walked toward the taxi stand and stood in the line there with her bag over her shoulder and her face calm and her breathing steady and her mind doing what it always did, which was look forward at what was coming and find the shape of it before it arrived. The file would be waiting for her tonight. The truth, or as much of it as could be documented, would be waiting for her. And after that, she would begin deciding what came next. The line moved. She moved with it. She got in a cab. She gave the name of her hotel. The cab pulled out into Washington traffic and she watched the airport disappear in the side mirror and then she turned and looked straight ahead through the windshield at the road in front of her, and she did not look back again.